The story of Mercer Hayes and Dakota Loftus began on a chilly October day in the year 2020. Mercer was working from home as usual, immersed in lines of code on his monitor. His measured life as a programmer was disrupted by a leak in the ceiling. Water dripped directly onto his desktop, forcing him to seek temporary shelter at the nearest coffee shop. Dakota was there, tall, trim, with short platinum hair and a tenacious look in her brown eyes. She noticed his confusion as he tried to find an empty seat and offered to share a table. Her confidence and directness were appealing, as was her easy smile that exposed the barely noticeable gap between her front teeth. Their conversation stretched over 3 cups of coffee. Dakota talked about her work as a CrossFit coach, about the importance of overcoming yourself and getting stronger. Mercer listened, fascinated by her energy, such a contrast to his own measured nature. He had never met a woman who could talk so enthusiastically about weightlifting while quoting Vonnegut. 6 months later, they were married. It was a modest wedding. The pandemic dictated the terms, but they had enough of each other and a few close friends. Brent Caulfield, Mercer's best friend since his college days, was best man and made a moving speech about the importance of finding someone who compliments you. By the spring of 2022, they had bought a house in the suburbs, small but cozy, with a white picket fence and room for a future garden. Dakota turned the garage into a home gym where she did online workouts. Mercer set up his office on the 2nd floor, overlooking the maples growing along the street. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple. Dakota taught Mercer the basics of proper nutrition and created an exercise program for him. He helped her create a website for her fitness business and set up an online enrollment system. On weekends, they would have movie marathons or get outdoors. Neighbors often saw them jogging together in the mornings. But by the end of that year, something subtly changed. Maybe it was the way Dakota began to react to Mercer's refusals to join in the workouts, or the way she increasingly criticized his habit of working late. Her remarks about his figure, which had once sounded like playful teasing, took on a sarcastic tone. Mercer began to notice that he started avoiding social gatherings with friends. He was uncomfortable with the way Dakota might ridicule his habits or decisions in front of others. She called it concern for his health and image, but something in her tone made him feel small and insignificant. Brent was the only one who dared to notice the change. Once, during a rare lunch break without Dakota, he'd asked Mercer if everything was okay. Mercer guffawed and turned the conversation to work, but noticed his friend's worried look. That night, back home, he thought for the first time that their perfect life might not be as perfect as it seemed to others. Dakota greeted him with her usual smile, but something cold flashed in her eyes when she found out he'd had dinner with Brent. "You know, honey," she said, "I just want you to be the best version of yourself. Is that a bad thing?" Mercer shook his head and smiled back, feeling a vague anxiety growing inside. He lay awake for a long time that night, listening to his wife's steady breathing and trying to figure out exactly when their story had started to change. At the gym, Dakota was a different person. Clients saw her as the epitome of strength and discipline. She demanded total commitment, and people obeyed her commanding tone, accepting pain and fatigue as the necessary payment for perfection. 8 more reps! Her voice echoed off the walls of the home gym. "You can do more, Jessica. Stop whining." On the laptop screen, a young woman gasped as she tried to hold the bar. Dakota leaned toward the camera. "I said hold it. Your body obeys you, not the other way around." Mercer, passing by, cringed at the harshness of her tone. He was noticing more and more how that bossiness was creeping into their personal lives. After practice, Dakota would return to the house flustered, any deviation from her ideas of order irritating. "Why didn't you put the dishes away?" She stood in the doorway of his office with her arms crossed over her chest. "And why are you still working? It's almost 10 o'clock at night." "I'm on a deadline," Mercer tried to sound calm. "I'm almost done." "You always have deadlines, and then you complain about back pain. You know what would help? Regular exercise. But no, you'd rather sit here and ruin your health." Her words had the usual flavor of concern, but her eyes remained cold. Mercer felt his fingers begin to tremble over the keyboard. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he promised. 5. Dakota cut him off and walked out, deliberately leaving the door open. A week later, Brent invited them to a barbecue. Dakota declined, citing an online seminar on sports nutrition, but insisted that Mercer go. "You need to unwind," she said with a smile that made him squeeze inside. "Just don't stay out too late." At Brent's, Mercer felt like himself for the first time in a long time. They talked about new projects, reminisced about their college years, laughed at old jokes. But when the conversation turned to family life, Mercer faltered halfway through. "What's going on, friend?" Brent handed him a new bottle of beer. "You've changed, and it's not just that you've lost weight." Mercer twirled the bottle in his hands. "It's okay. Dakota takes care of me. Maybe a little too insistent sometimes, but..." "Insistent?" Brent stepped forward. "The last time the five of us saw each other, she reprimanded you in front of everyone for the second slice of pizza, like a child. She's into healthy living." "Mercer," Brent put a hand on his shoulder. "Remember Carol? My sister? What she went through?" Of course he remembered. Carol had lived for 2 years with a man who controlled her every move, every bite she ate, every minute spent, all under the pretense of caring. At 9 o'clock, Mercer's cell phone vibrated. "Where are you?" A short message from Dakota made him wince. "I gotta go." He rose, feeling his friend's gaze on him. "You know I'm always around, right?" Brent said, walking him to the door. "Anytime." At home, Dakota was waiting for him in the kitchen. Her gym uniform was still damp from her workout. "How was your evening?" she asked, deceptively softly. "Good. Brent said to say hi. You smell like beer." "I drank 2 bottles. So all our efforts are for naught?" Her voice got harsher. "I work so hard on your diet and you..." For the first time, Mercer noticed her fingers twitching as they gripped the back of the chair. In that moment, he realized he was afraid of his own wife. That realization hit him under the breath harder than any physical blow. "I'm tired," he said quietly. "I'm going to go to bed." "Of course," Dakota smiled. "We have practice at 6 in the morning tomorrow. Remember?" Walking up the stairs, he pulled out his phone and opened a message from Brent. "I'm here if you need to talk." Mercer stared at those words for a long moment before deleting the message. In the bedroom, he carefully placed the phone screen down, knowing that Dakota often checked his correspondences, concerned about his social connections. The first blow came in early spring. Mercer had missed his morning workout, oversleeping after a night working on an urgent project. Dakota was silently picking up scattered dumbbells from the floor when he came down to the kitchen. "I'm sorry, I'm just really tired," he began. A dumbbell flew into the wall next to his head. Mercer froze, unable to believe his eyes. Dakota stepped up close, her breathing heavy like after an intense workout. "I'm wasting my time and energy on you, and you can't even show me basic respect." Her hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white. The blow came to her shoulder, quick, professional. "It's so you'll remember how important discipline is." Then she cried, hugged him, apologized, talked about the stress, how much she cared about his health. Mercer forgave, convinced himself that it was an accident, a breakdown, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. A week later, he refused a protein shake and got a slap on the wrist. 2 more weeks later, he was late for an online meeting with coworkers. Dakota knocked his laptop out of his hands and pushed him so hard he hit a bookcase. "You instigate it yourself," she said afterward. "It's not like I'm just mad. I care about you and you're acting like an irresponsible child." Mercer started wearing long sleeves even in warm weather. Learned to cover up bruises with foundation he'd secretly bought at a convenience store. Dakota controlled their joint account, so he started putting aside change from his lunches, building up an emergency fund. She checked his phone, his email, his browser history. "It's for your own safety, honey. So many scammers on the internet." Turned off his social media notifications, deleted the contacts of unnecessary people. Brent tried to reach out through work email. "You missed 3 of our traditional Friday night calls. What's going on?" Mercer stared at the screen, feeling his fingers go numb. Footsteps sounded behind him. Dakota liked to sneak up unheard. "That Brent guy again?" She put her hands on his shoulders, squeezing too hard. "You know, I think he's a bad influence on you. Always distracting you from important things." "He's my best friend." "Was, in college. You're all grown up now. You need a different environment. Her fingers dug in even harder. Text him that you're busy with an important project and that you need to focus on your career. That same evening, she accidentally smashed his cell phone. She bought a new one with parental controls and geolocation tracking. At work, Mercer tried to keep a low profile, turned off the camera on calls, citing bad internet. He stopped socializing with co-workers in informal settings. His world shrunk to the size of their house, where every corner was a threat. One morning, while Dakota was working out in the garage, he caught his reflection in the office window. The droopy face, the wan gaze, the abrasion on his cheekbone, bad fall during practice. He didn't recognize himself. Dakota had been especially gentle that day, cooked his favorite dinner, massaged his shoulders while he worked out. "See how good it can feel when you obey?" she whispered. "We're made for each other. Only I know what you really need." At night, listening to her steady breathing, Mercer thought for the first time about leaving. But to where? She controlled their finances. He had no friends to turn to. The family lived in another state, and he'd long since lost touch with them. Dakota insisted they needed to make a life for themselves. In the bathroom, where he'd slipped in the morning, he'd scrawled one word on the fogged mirror: "Help." He wiped it off with a shaky hand. Dakota's footsteps were heard outside the door, and he hurriedly turned on the water. "Honey," her voice was as sweet as molasses, "don't forget we're practicing together today. I'll show you some new exercises." Mercer nodded to his reflection in the mirror, trying to smile. The mask of the obedient husband lay habitually on his face. But somewhere deep inside, the thought began to dawn that it couldn't go on like this. The decision came after Dakota had broken 2 of his fingers. "Didn't do the bench press right," she explained to the doctor at the trauma center, placing her hand on her husband's shoulder. Her grip was soft, but Mercer felt an underlying threat in every touch. This time the doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, asked Dakota to wait in the hallway. As soon as the door closed, she looked at Mercer carefully. "This isn't your first injury in months," she said quietly, looking over his chart, and all while practicing at home. Mercer remained silent, looking at his hands. "Here," she held out a business card to him. "Here's the phone number for the domestic violence hotline. And my work number." He tucked the card into his pocket, knowing Dakota would find it anyway at the next checkup. But this conversation had changed something. That evening, while his wife did her online workout, Mercer logged onto a support site for abuse victims through his work laptop. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he hadn't lost his mind. Other people's stories were frighteningly similar to his own. The next day, he sent an encrypted message to Brent from his work computer. "I need help. This is not a joke. Can you come to my office at lunchtime?" Brent showed up 2 hours later. When he saw his friend, he turned pale. "Jesus, Merc, what did she do to you?" At the cafe across the street from the office, Mercer told everything for the first time. About the beatings, the control, the constant fear. His voice trailed off. His hands shook, but he spoke without stopping, as if he was afraid there would be no second chances. "We're going to the police," Brent was adamant. "Right now." At the station, a detective from the domestic violence unit took them in. Mercer showed the bruises, talked about the broken fingers, showed the tapes of conversations he'd been secretly making for the past month. "We see this more often than you think," the detective said as he filled out the report. "Men rarely report violence by women. They're ashamed." The report was filed. Mercer got a temporary protective order. Brent insisted his friend move in with him. "She can't know where you are," he said, helping pack his things while Dakota was at away practice. "You'll stay with me until you get back on your feet." Dakota called that evening. Her voice was calm. "Honey, where are you? I'm worried." "I'm leaving you." His voice shook. "I've filed a police report." There was silence. Then she laughed. "Do you really think anyone would believe that such a big man was the victim of domestic violence? That I, a small woman, could beat you up? You'd be laughed at. I have proof." "You have nothing." Her voice became hard. "I, on the other hand, have tapes of you threatening me. Remember how you yelled at me last month? I wrote it all down. And the bruises on your arms, do you think it's hard to get them done?" Mercer felt nausea coming up to his throat. "You're not going anywhere from me," she continued. "You're mine. And you'll always be mine. The next day, 3 police officers showed up at Mercer's office. Dakota filed a counterclaim, accusing her husband of domestic violence. She had photos of bruises, recordings of him screaming, testimony from neighbors. A supervisor called Mercer to his office. "I don't care what's going on in your home," he said, "but the company doesn't need this kind of scandal." That evening, he sat in Brent's apartment staring at one point. The phone was bursting with messages. Somehow everyone knew about the allegations. Colleagues wrote ambiguous comments. A local social media group had a post about a poor woman victimized by a tyrant husband. "We'll get through this." Brent squeezed his shoulder. "You have proof. The truth is on your side." Mercer nodded, but a black void was growing inside. He knew Dakota, she wouldn't stop. And for the first time ever, he felt not just fear, but genuine dread of what might happen next. The radio was playing quietly in Brent Caulfield's apartment when the owner discovered the body. Mercer was lying in a bathtub filled with water, his head submerged, one arm dangling lifelessly over the edge. A phone with a cracked screen and scattered pills from an overturned vial lay on the floor nearby. Brent remembered the emergency call like a blur. His own voice seemed alien when he gave the address to the dispatcher. Patrol officers were the first to arrive, then the paramedics, who had no choice but to pronounce him dead. Detectives showed up 40 minutes after the call. Sloane Ridgway, a middle-aged woman with an attentive eye, immediately took control of the situation. Her partner, Aidan Mako, began surveying the scene, methodically photographing every detail. "Tell us how you discovered him." Ridgway sat across from Brent in the living room while the forensics team worked in the bathroom. "I came back from the store, about 7 o'clock at night. Called him in. Thought maybe he was sleeping. Then I saw the bathroom light." Brent fell silent, clutching an untouched coffee cup in his hands. "How long has he been staying with you?" "Fourth 24 hours, after he applied for a wife." Ridgway glanced over to the approaching Mako. "A domestic violence report?" "Yes, Dakota, his wife. She beat him, controlled his every move. And then, when he decided to leave, she filed a counterclaim, accused him of violence." Mako pulled out a clipboard. "Dakota Hayes, the CrossFit coach?" "Yes, she runs her own fitness center." Ridgway scrutinized the living room. "No sign of forced entry. Was the door locked when you got back?" "Yes. Mercer had his own key." "Who else knew he was here?" "Only the police and his lawyer. We were afraid Dakota would track him down." A CSI came out of the bathroom. "Detective Ridgway, you should see this." The bathroom was cold. The body had already been covered, but on the fogged-up mirror, the CSI found the inscription, "Sorry." Shards from a broken glass lay on the floor, and there were signs of a struggle on the tub rim. "Looks like suicide at first glance," Mako said quietly, looking at the scattered pills. "Too similar." Ridgway leaned over the tub. "Note the marks on the neck and wrists, and the position of the body. Something's not right here." She returned to the living room. "Mr. Caulfield, we need to know every detail of his relationship with his wife. Every detail." For the next hour, Brent talked. About how Mercer had changed since the wedding, the bruises he tried to hide, about the broken fingers, and the constant scrutiny. "Does he still have a working laptop?" Ridgway asked. "Yes, in the guest room. He was working remotely." Mako went to check the laptop, and Ridgway continued her questioning. "How has he been acting the last few days?" "Been tense. Afraid to go outside. Dakota sent threatening texts from different numbers. But he wasn't thinking about suicide, if that's what you mean. On the contrary, he was talking about the future, planned to move to another city." "Detective!" Mako called out from the guest room. A hidden folder of video recordings was found in the laptop. He was secretly filming their conversations. Ridgway looked through several files. On the screen, Dakota was methodically beating her husband, saying, "This is for your own good, honey. You need to learn to obey." "Bring her in for questioning." Ridgway slammed the laptop shut. "And check the cameras in a 5-block radius. Something tells me this isn't a suicide." When the detectives left, Brent was alone in the hushed apartment. He stared at the closed bathroom door, where the CSIs were still working, and thought back to their last conversation with Mercer. "You know," the friend had said then, "for the first time in a long time, I feel safe." That was last night. And at 7 o'clock today, he was found dead in his bathtub, The police station greeted Detective Ridgway with the usual morning bustle. A cardboard cup of coffee smoked on the desk. Mako always came early and took care of his partner. Next to it lay a folder with the preliminary medical examiner's report. She opened the first page. Death occurred between 6 and 7 in the evening. Multiple contusions of varying degrees of age, traces of old fractures, high concentration of barbiturates in the blood. Preliminary cause of death is drowning, but there are signs of a struggle before death. Forensics sent over the print results. Mako put another folder on the table. They found a partial print on the faucet in the bathroom. Doesn't belong to either the victim or Caulfield. Ridgway tapped her fingers on the desk thoughtfully. Cameras? Checking footage from all the nearby buildings. Nothing unusual so far, but there's a blind spot between Caulfield's house and a neighboring building. The first witness was brought into the interview room, Brent's neighbor, an older woman with neatly styled gray hair. That night I was walking Pippin, who is my poodle, she recounted, nervously rubbing the strap of her purse. I saw some woman standing in the driveway, tall, athletic, with blonde hair. I thought she had a nice figure. What time was that? About 6:30. Pippin's very punctual, always walks at the same time. Next came the delivery boy from the food delivery service. Yes, I used to bring the order to that house about 6. Went up to the 3rd floor, walked past the right apartment. Heard some noise, but it's not much what people do in the evening. Ridgway studied his face carefully. What kind of noise exactly? Sounds like an argument. A man's voice and a woman's voice, but muffled, through the door. Then something fell, smashed. By lunchtime, the toxicologists sent back a detailed analysis. In the victim's stomach, they found remnants of dissolved sleeping pills, a potent barbiturate. A prescription for the drug had been written to Dakota 2 months ago. Does Dakota Hayes have an alibi? Ridgway looked at the security footage on her laptop. Claims she was doing a group training session at her center. 10 witnesses. Check their connections to her, every single one of them. On Ridgway's desk was the waterman's report. The temperature of the bathwater, the fill level, the marks on the tile all indicated that Mercer was still alive when he was submerged. The effects of the sleeping pills should have weakened the resistance, but there was still a struggle. By late afternoon, a picture began to emerge. Among the center's regulars was one Rachel Morgan, an ex-military hand-to-hand combat specialist. A camera in a nearby alley caught a car registered in her name in the vicinity of Brent's house around 5 p.m. Bring her in for questioning, Ridgway rubbed her tired eyes. Already tried that. She's disappeared. Apartment's empty, phone's disconnected. The phone rang on the desk. It was the bank checking on Dakota Hayes' recent transactions. 2 days ago, a large cash withdrawal was made from her account. She made a mistake. Ridgway looked at the picture of a smiling Dakota. An emotional killer always makes a mistake. We just need to find where she stumbled. In the evidence folder was a photo of a fogged mirror with the words, "I'm sorry," written on it. Handwriting experts have already confirmed it was written in the left hand, presumably a woman's. Another piece of evidence that Mercer Hayes' death was not a suicide. The police station smelled of coffee and old paper. Detective Ridgway was going through case files, arranging them chronologically on her desk. A fine rain drizzled outside the window, making the fluorescent lights reflect in the wet asphalt in blurry patches. The interrogation of Dakota Hayes was inconclusive. She showed up at the station at exactly the right time, trim, in an impeccably tailored business suit. She smelled of expensive perfume and had a slight half-smile on her face that hadn't wavered once during the 2 hours of conversation. The day Mercer died, I ran a group training session from 6 to 7 in the evening. Her voice sounded calm and confident. 20 clients can attest to that. The videos from my center's cameras are at your disposal. Ridgway felt irritation boiling up inside. Dakota's blonde hair was gathered into a perfect ponytail, not a single strand dislodged as impeccable control as she had over her every word. And the prescription for the barbiturates? Ridgway laid a copy of the prescription in front of her. I'm having trouble sleeping. Stress after his accusations, you know? Dakota shrugged carelessly. By the way, do you have a copy of my domestic violence report? There are some interesting details in there. After the interrogation, Ridgway sat in her office for a long time, looking at the crime scene photos. In the semi-darkness of the office, the pictures seemed particularly grim. A fogged mirror with writing on it, an overturned vial, signs of a struggle on the tiled floor. Found something interesting. Mako placed an old newspaper clipping in front of her. The paper was yellowed with time, but the text was still clearly legible. Remember the Carol Caulfield case? Our Brent's sister? That's right. 5 years ago she died in a bathtub. The official version was an accident. Her husband claimed she took too many sedatives and choked to death. Ridgway straightened, feeling a chill run down her back. Similar handwriting. And that's not all. Guess who Carol's husband's lawyer was? Who? Rachel Morgan. Before she went into fitness coaching, she worked at a law firm specializing in family law, the office filled with the rustling of papers. Ridgway began taking quick notes. Outside the window, the rain intensified, drumming on the eaves like a metronome counting down the clock. Check all the connections. How did Morgan meet Dakota? Why did she leave the law? By late afternoon, the picture began to clear. The police database revealed a series of similar cases. 3 of Morgan's clients, all accused of domestic violence, had died under similar circumstances. All the cases were closed as suicides. Mako, who had been reviewing the surveillance footage, suddenly pitched forward. She didn't disappear. She changed her appearance. Look. On the screen, one of the clients of the Dakota Fitness Center was exiting the building. The characteristic military alignment, the distinctive way she held her head, undoubtedly Rachel Morgan. She was in our face the whole time. Ridgway reached for the phone when it suddenly rang on its own. It was Brent Caulfield calling. His voice sounded agitated. "Detective, I remembered something. The day my sister died, Carol told me about some woman lawyer, said she promised to help her get away from her husband." There was a heavy silence in the office, broken only by the sound of the rain. "One more thing, Detective. I found an old photograph. Dakota was at Carol's funeral. Standing off to the side, I didn't think much of it at the time, but now... Stay at home, Mr. Caulfield. We'll send patrol officers out to you." Ridgway hung up the phone and stared for a long time at the picture of a smiling Dakota pinned to the evidence board. In the dim light of the desk lamp, her smile seemed sinister. "They're not just killers," she said finally. "They think of themselves as vigilantes, the administrators of justice. But Mercer was the victim, not the rapist," Mako pointed out, holding out another file folder to her. "Exactly. He broke their rules, went against the system, reported a woman." On the table lay a folder with Carol Caulfield's case file. Somewhere in those documents lay the clue the moment Rachel Morgan began her crusade, and Dakota, with her perfect smile and steely self-control, became her most effective weapon. The old photographs in the Social Support Center's archives were faded and yellowed with time. Ridgway went through them one by one until she froze over a snapshot from 8 years ago, a group portrait, a dozen women, and among them 2 familiar figures. Dakota Loftus, not yet Hayes with long dark hair, and Rachel Morgan, a slender brunette in a business suit. They stood side by side, shoulders touching, and smiled tensely into the camera. The break room at the police station smelled of strong coffee and fatigue. Mako spread out the paperwork on the table, collating dates and events. "They never broke up after that support group." He ran his finger along the lines in the file. "Rachel had just gotten the insurance policy for her husband's death at the time. An accident at work." "Accident?" Ridgway raised an eyebrow. "Fell from scaffolding. Witnesses claimed he was drunk, but the toxicology report came back clean. Case closed." Outside the window, rain drizzled down, turning the evening city into a blurry watercolor. Ridgway stared at the old photographs, trying to see the future killers in these tormented women. "Dakota had a history," Mako continued. "Her first husband beat her for 3 years. She went to the police twice, but withdrew the reports. Classic pattern. And then they met in a support group. And 6 months later, they opened a fitness center. Officially, Rachel's money was an investment. Dakota went from being an office worker to a fitness trainer." The phone on the desk rang. The lab was calling. Ridgway put it on speaker. "Traces of BCAA and creatine were found in the victim's blood." The lab technician's voice sounded agitated. "But the composition is unusual. It's a special formula, manufactured to order. For whom? For the Steel Lady Fitness Center, owned by Dakota Hayes. Ridgway glanced over to Mako, another lead. They used sports nutrition as the perfect cover. Mako opened the crime scene photos on his laptop. Slipped sleeping pills into the protein shake. Who would suspect? Ridgway went back to the old photos. For 8 years, the support group had met weekly. In each photo, Dakota and Rachel were together, growing closer each month. Their faces changed. The huntedness disappeared. The toughness emerged. You know what the worst part is? Ridgway set the photos aside. They started out with good intentions. They wanted to help other victims, and they turned into what they were trying to protect others from, Mako finished. The system failed them. Ridgway walked to the window. The police didn't help. The courts didn't protect. So they decided to create their own justice system. And Mercer broke their rules. A man reporting a woman for domestic violence, it went against everything they believed in. A clock ticked on the station wall, counting down the minutes until the next step in the investigation. Ridgway stared at the photos and thought about how thin the line was between justice and revenge, between protection and violence. Order a search warrant for the fitness center, she said finally. Let's check all the shipments of sports nutrition, and get me a list of all the members of that cheerleading squad. We need to make sure Mercer's the only victim. But she already knew. Killing Mercer wasn't their first crime. And if they weren't stopped, it wouldn't be their last. Sorting through a dead friend's belongings wasn't an easy job. Brent was methodically putting Mercer's clothes into boxes when something jingled in the pocket of an old sports jacket. The small, black-cased flash drive seemed insignificant, but his hands trembled for some reason as he plugged it into his laptop. The first file was dated 2 weeks before his death. Dakota's voice, recorded apparently through the phone, sounded muffled. He ruined everything, Rach. Do you understand? Everything we built, everything we worked for. One damn call to the police. Calm down, the second voice, which Brent now recognized as Rachel Morgan's voice. We have a plan. The old scheme will work here too. But this is different. I mean, he's a traitor, Dakota. Worse than anyone we've dealt with before. A man who accuses a woman of violence? He's discrediting all the real victims. Brent listened to the tape, feeling a chill go down inside. The next file was recorded at the gym, a conversation about a special batch of sports nutrition, about dosages, about how important it was to get everything right. An hour later, he was already at the police station. Detective Ridgway sat beside him, listening to the tapes for the third time. When did you find the flash drive? This morning. I was packing up his stuff. Brent stammered. He always wore that jacket to practice. At that moment, Mako entered the office with printouts. The fitness center had a camera above the lockers. Dakota went through the footage every night. So she saw Mercer hiding his cell phone for the recording. Ridgway frowned. And she must have seen him tuck the flash drive into his pocket. But he left the jacket at my place. Brent went pale. The day before he died. The phone on the desk rang. The desk clerk reported that the Steel Lady Fitness Center had received a call from the precinct 10 minutes ago, someone requesting information about the evidence they'd found. Who called? Ridgway jumped up. An intern from the archives, said he was gathering case files. We don't have interns at the archives. Mako was already dialing the number for the rapid response team. Brent felt a chill run down his spine. My house. I left my laptop and flash drive at home. Let's go now. Ridgway grabbed her jacket. Mako, call for backup at Brent's address. They made it in time. Dakota was already in the apartment, a trim figure in a black tracksuit frozen by the desk, when the cops appeared in the doorway. In her hand, she held the familiar black casing of a flash drive. Don't move! Ridgway pointed the gun. Detective, Dakota smiled her trademark coach smile. I just stopped by to visit a family friend. Brent is taking Mercer's death so hard, and brought along the same vitamins found in your husband's blood? Mako nodded at the capsules scattered across the table. Sports nutrition, I'm a trainer, remember? Hands behind your head. Ridgway stepped forward. You're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Mercer Hayes. That's funny. Dakota slowly raised her hands. You know, he didn't believe a woman could be dangerous either. Didn't believe it until the very end. Already handcuffed, she turned to Brent. He shouldn't have betrayed us. We were helping people, saving them, and he He ruined everything. Footsteps could be heard in the hallway. The extraction team was coming up the stairs. "Where's Rachel Morgan?" Ridgway asked. Dakota only smiled. "You're a smart woman, detective. You must realize, sometimes the system is unfair, and someone has to restore that justice." The flash drive was seized as evidence. Scattered capsules were left on the table, just like the ones found in Mercer's blood. Another failed victim on the list of 2 women who decided to be the enforcers of justice. The interrogation room seemed smaller than usual. Dakota sat at the table, still as focused and trim as if she hadn't spent the previous night in a cell. Only there was a new gleam in her eyes, something akin to feverish excitement. "I want to tell you a story, detective," she pitched forward. "About justice, about how the system breaks people and then wonders why they fight back." Ridgway silently turned on the recorder. "You know what the worst thing about domestic violence is? Not the beatings, not the control. It's that no one believes it. The police, the courts, even your own family, everyone turns away." Her voice sounded calm, almost detached, like she was giving a fitness lecture. "Rachel and I found each other when we were at rock bottom. 2 broken women in a support group. But we didn't want to be victims. We decided to become advocates." "Protectors?" Ridgway raised an eyebrow. "At first we were just helping other women get away from tyrant husbands. The fitness center became the perfect cover-up place where women felt safe, where they could become stronger." She fell silent, looking somewhere through the wall. "And then we realized that sometimes leaving wasn't enough, that the system would fail anyway. So we started fixing the system's mistakes." In the adjoining interrogation room, Mako was talking to Rachel Morgan. She'd been found in an abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. She hadn't even tried to escape. "It was all me," Rachel said. "I planned Mercer's murder. I got the sleeping pills. Dakota was just following my instructions, but the records said otherwise. So did the DNA traces on the murder weapon and the fingerprints on the vial of sleeping pills." "Why Mercer?" Ridgway asked, turning back to Dakota. "He betrayed everything we worked for. A man accusing a woman of violence that insulted the memory of every real victim, every woman who wasn't believed. And the fact that he was a victim himself? There are no male victims of domestic violence." Steel cut through Dakota's voice for the first time. "There are only manipulators who use the system against women." The trial took place 3 months later. The room was full. Journalists, activists, former clients of the fitness center. Dakota and Rachel sat next to each other but didn't look at each other. The prosecutor presented irrefutable evidence, recordings of conversations, results of expert examinations, testimony of witnesses. The story of 2 women who decided to do their own justice unfolded before the jury in every detail. "Defendant," the judge looked at Dakota. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before sentencing?" She stood up, in a strict business suit, with a straight back and her head held high. "I'm not asking for an apology. Everything we did was right. The system broke us, and we built our own, a fairer one. And if I had to do it again, I would do the same." The sentence was harsh, life in prison without parole. Rachel got 25 years as an accessory. As they were being led away from the courtroom, Dakota paused next to Brent for a moment. "You know," she said quietly, "Mercer was right about something. Violence remains violence no matter who commits it." Ridgway watched the door of the police van slam shut. The story was over, but the questions remained. Where is the line between justice and revenge? When does a defender become an executioner? And is it possible to fix the system without becoming a reflection of it? The rain washed the police car tracks off the asphalt. Somewhere in the city, other victims were waiting for help. Other criminals were preparing alibis. Detective work never ends. It only changes shape.